I recently learned a valuable lesson. Just like you don't chop up chili peppers and then go to the bathroom without washing your hands, don't handle barley and then rub your f***ing eyeball without washing your hands. See what I mean?
I just said, yes, man, right away, anything.
Apparently I am not the only person that had that happen, according to Google anyway. So, wash your hands. Alright, so moving on. Now, thanks to my patrons, thank you guys, I was able to get a 50-pound bag of seed barley. So today is all about malting that barley and turning some of it into specialty grains for brewing. I'm really excited about this. I hope you guys are too. So if you don't already know, quick capsule review of what malting actually is. It's basically just germination of barley grains. You trick them into growing just a tiny bit and then stopping the process early. The reason why we do this is to get the grain to produce amylase enzymes that are going to convert the starches in that grain into sugars so that we can then ferment it. The seeds do this naturally all by themselves so that the little plant that's going to grow out of there can have energy in the form of sugar to grow. So we harness that process to get the enzymes that we want in the amounts that we want. Since you can't ferment starch, you can only ferment sugar. We need those enzymes to do the conversion for us inside the grain so that we can take that sugar and turn it into alcohol and carbon dioxide through fermentation. Maybe it's just me, but I think Mother Nature is a badass. Alright, so if you want to try this project, I highly recommend you get some seed barley, not feed barley. Seed barley has a much higher germination rate than feed barley. Seed barley is usually 90%, feed barley is usually 70 to 80%. Before we get started, I just want to mention that the way I malt is not considered best practices by commercial standards, but it is reasonably achievable with what I have and what most of us have access to. Case in point, the recommended temperature for malting barley is between 50 and 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, that shit ain't gonna work here because it's 90 degrees outside and 75 in my house. So there is no place in my environment that I can get to those temperatures. But if we're careful about this, we can actually get a really good product that's going to work for us. If you want to dive deeper into the nerding aspect of this part of the hobby, malting is just as much of an art and science as brewing and distilling. So there is a ton of information. And a good place to start is Brewing Beer the Hard Way. That's a good YouTube channel. He has tons of information about malting, but he has even more on his blog. So I'm gonna put both of those links down in the video description. To get started, we're gonna use some plastic totes that fit into each other to do the first stage of the malting process. I drilled a bunch of holes into one of these to drain the barley for the air rests. 1/8 inch drill bit will do just fine. So you weigh out the grain that you wanna malt, and keep in mind that you're gonna end up with 80% of whatever you start with. My recommendation is get one of these T-balls. I'll put a link for one down in the video description. Basically what you're going to do is weigh out 5 grams of grain and stick it in this T-ball before you get started. Leave it in your batch of grain all the way through the process, because we're going to take it out and we're going to weigh the grain inside several times to figure out what our moisture content is so that we know what stage of the process we're at. Cool? T-ball. So you dump all your grain into your tote, and then you're going to rinse it 3 times to get all the dirt and crap off of it, and to skim off all the floating seeds because those are dead and they're most likely carrying mold spores, so you want to get them out. Once the grain is cleaned off, you're going to fill the tub up one more time so there's a few inches of water sitting over the top of that grain, and then just let it sit for 8 hours. After 8 hours, you drain all the water out, give it one more rinse before you let it sit to air dry. And you're gonna let it dry for 8 hours. That's your air rest. You wanna cover it with a damp towel so the top layer doesn't dry out. But you need to come by and give it a stir 3 to 4 times in that 8-hour air rest. So after the second steep and the second air rest, you need to start checking for chits. Chits are the tiny little white dots at the ends of the grain. That's basically the beginning of the root growth. Now, if you're doing this at cooler temperatures, the temperature range that they recommend between 50 and 65 degrees, this may take 4 or 5 cycles before you get to the chit stage. For me, because it's so damn warm in here, it's usually 2. So keep that in mind. If it's warmer, things tend to grow a little faster. Now's the time to get the weight from the grain inside your T-ball, and make sure you get all that grain out of the T-ball, because sometimes it'll stick in the little mesh here. And since that grain is going to be probably soaking wet, since you're just out of the air drying stage, best thing you can do is put it onto a paper towel and blot it dry. You want it to have no surface moisture at all, so that you get as accurate of a reading of the internal moisture content as you can. And then just weigh it. Mine ended up being 3 grams heavier, so it was 8 grams instead of 5. Most barley starts out having an inherent moisture content of about 12%. By doing the steeping, we're looking to raise that up into the 40s. So you soak it, air rest it, soak it, air rest it, until you get to about 42%. Well, how do you know when you get to 42%? Well, there's a simple math formula for that, and I'm going to put that right here on the screen. And then I'm going to go get my graphing calculator. Yes, I have a graphing calculator. Who doesn't? This is your original moisture content. This is your new weight, and this is your starting weight. And that gave me a moisture content of 45%. Now the butter zone for where you're aiming is usually around 42%. Overshooting is, in my mind, for what I'm going for here in my house, not that big a deal. Okay, so on to the malting. You can either do it in your original totes that you did the steeping in, and if you do that, split the batch into those 2 totes. That'll give you less density of the grain bed and make it easier for you to stir it. Less heat is going to build up, and I think you'll end up with a much better product. Or you can use the tumbler. I built a malt tumbler in a previous video. I'll put a link for that right up here if you want to see how I did it. I will say it's almost idiot proof. That's good for me. If you're going to use a tumbler, set it for 6 to 7 cycles of 30 minutes apiece. That way it'll tumble and move the grain around, aerate it, and get some of that heat dissipated off of it 6 or 7 times a day. And one other thing, if you're going to use the tumbler, barley bulks up a lot more than corn does when it's malting. When I used my tumbler before, I was able to put 10 pounds of corn into that tumbler. With barley, go for maybe 5 or 6 pounds. So this is what it looks like when you put 10 pounds in your tumbler. Look at how jam-packed this thing is. It is absolutely full, but it just smells like alfalfa sprouts. It's very, very fresh smelling. There's no funky, moldy bacteria, dog barf kind of smell to it, so that's awesome. Because we're malting in a warmer environment than what is recommended, my malt tends to look like it's finished in 2 to 3 days instead of 5 to 7 days, which is more typical. So to check the level of modification of your grain, just grab a handful of grain from your malt, set that down on a table, and then you're going to count out 50 grains. From those 50 grains, you're going to look at the little white stripe, the little white acrospire that's eventually going to be the plant. If it's 50% the length of the grain, it's under-modified. If it's 75% of the length of the grain, it's slightly under-modified. If it's 100% the length of the grain, it's fully modified. So when I say the malt is fully modified, what I mean is by industry standards, it has the enzyme content that we're looking for, but it hasn't grown so much that the little shoot or acrospire hasn't started to eat up the sugars in the grain. So separate those 50 grains into piles of 50%, 75%, 100% plus. As long as 75% of your total batch is at 75% or better of the modification length, then you can go ahead and move on to the drying process. It's easier for me to do what's called wilting and dry it out over fans in the garage. So I just took a couple of window screens off of my windows, put the malt on it over a ladder, over some fans, and then let it go for about 2 days. And you just come in every once in a while and stir that around so that you have a nice even drying. The ultimate goal for drying is to get the moisture content down below 10%. The reason why that's the magic number is because that helps the enzymes remain stable inside the grain despite what you do with it as far as toasting. So you can have a diastatic malt that has some toast on it, some color, like a Munich Malt. Since I can't go any lower with the wilting process, you've got to start adding some temperature. I don't have a malt kiln or a food dehydrator. A food dehydrator would be perfect. You need to get it to about 125 degrees for 6, 8, 10 hours. Since I am limited to just using my oven, it's a little trickier. Turn your oven on to its lowest setting. For me, that's 150 degrees. Put your malt on trays, stick that in the oven, and once the oven hits 150 degrees, turn it off and crack the door open. And that'll let the heat slowly dissipate out of the oven. You need to do that over many hours to get that moisture content down below 10% so that you can then make your specialty grains. What I do is I kind of float the temperature over that time. It'll most likely take you at least 6 to 8 hours to get that grain down to 10%. You're just going to take your grain from your T-ball, weigh it again, and check your moisture content. If you weigh the grain inside your T-ball and it is below the original 5 grams that you started with, then you need to use this formula. And I'll put it right here on the screen, and we'll do a quick example. All right, so let's whip out the old graphing calculator again. The change to this math formula is right in this section here. Here's our original math formula. This is my new weight of the grain. Instead of 5 grams, I got 4.3 grams. We're going to assume that we lost about 6% due to the grain eating the sugar. So it actually lost weight. Just like we burn calories, the grain actually burns some of its reserves in order to grow. We plug all that into this formula and we get 3.8% moisture. So we're definitely good to go. So now the moisture content is way below 10%, so we're good to go for anything else. And now basically you have pale malt. Now that the malt is done, we just have one last step, and that's to winnow the chaff. And that's basically to get all the roots and shoots and crap off of the grain so we have nice clean malt. And the easiest way to do that is just to dump it all into a 5-gallon bucket, and you're going to work your hands through that grain and, you know, rub it together, work through that grain for a good 5 to 10 minutes just to loosen all that crap up. And then you just pour small batches into a screen, shake it and stir it to get all that chaff out until no more falls out the bottom. So the last step in the process is making specialty malts. And this, luckily, is not very difficult. And it's a lot quicker than malting in general. Before you start your specialty malts, there's a couple things you need to know. The husk of the grain changes color really slowly compared to what's on the inside. Take a look at these. So this is Pale Malt. This is Munich Malt. This bowl right here is Crystal Malt. But I mean, look at that. They're really not that much different. So when you're pulling these trays of grain out of the oven, you can't go based on what it looks like on the outside because it's lying to you. What you need to do is take the grains, slice a few of them lengthwise, and see what the grain looks like on the inside. And that's the only way you're going to be able to tell what's really going on. Thing number 2, your house is going to smell like burnt toast, like a lot, when you start making these specialty malts. So the last little tip is stirring. Stir this stuff. Stir it every 20 to 30 minutes because the grain on the outside of that tray is going to start to get a lot darker than the stuff in the middle. So you need to move it all into a pile in the center and then stir it around a little bit and spread it all back out. Do that every half an hour so that you get a much more even coloring and toasting on your grain. The pale malt gives you this nice kind of golden colored wort. And it's got a nice clean smell. It's very earthy, very fresh, tiny bit sweet. From that pale malt, the easiest malt that you can make is a brown malt. And it's just pale malt that you toast in the oven at 350 for about an hour to an hour and a half. And this is what it looks like on the inside. And the cool thing about this is it gives you this really nice brown, slightly amber color. The brown malt looks kind of biscuity and chalky on the inside. It's hard to tell what's that actually going to do in a beer. Well, the easiest thing you could do is crush a little bit of it in a mortar and pestle, throw it into a French press or just a cup of hot water and make a tea. That's what all these cups are. They're just tea that I made with the barley to see what it was going to look like and to taste and get a general idea of the flavors that were going to come through. That brown malt, interestingly, has a slight chocolatey note and a coffee note. It's not a dark toast, it's a medium toast, but it's got those flavors in it. And I think that's really cool. And that's just the easiest one to make. we can get a little bit more challenging. Like if you want to make Munich Malt, it is one of the most common malts that you'll find in most German beers with any color to them. Let's say you got your Pale Malt down to 9% moisture content. You're going to heat that at 150 degrees until you get it down to 6%. And that's really going to lock in those enzymes so that you have a diastatic malt, because a Munich malt is a diastatic malt. It has some diastatic power, not as much as Pale Malt, but it does still retain some. And then you roast it at 220 Fahrenheit for about 4 hours. And that's it. That's all you got to do. So when you slice this stuff open, it looks like this. One of the more aggressively flavored malts is Chocolate Malt. Let's get a real close look at that. Look at that stuff. Looks like coffee beans or rat turds. So that stuff, you just take your Pale Malt, put it on a tray, and roast it at 425 Fahrenheit for 2 to 2.5 hours. You definitely want to stir this one every half an hour because it's a very aggressive temperature to toast grains at, and it's going to want to smoke. You don't want it to burn. You're not looking for black malt, you're looking for a dark toast. What I did is I actually did mine in a sauté pan on the stovetop and just cooked it on about medium heat and danced it around in the pan. But it still took over an hour to do. But I think I got a little bit better control on the color. Since it's direct heat, you're a lot more likely to burn it than not. So definitely keep it moving. The cool thing about that stuff is that it came out with no bitterness, but it definitely tastes, it has a strong coffee note. The color of the tea, it's a dark brown and blood ruby kind of thing going on, so it's really, really rich. And it brings a lot of flavor. So that one I am really excited to use. Okay, so the last two that we're going to talk about are caramel and crystal malts. The term caramel malt and crystal malt are somewhat interchangeable. There's two methods to make a caramel/crystal malt. They are actually mashed like a beer mash to convert the starches into sugars before we do the toasting. So they're going to be full of sugar. They'll have zero diastatic power, but they're going to add a lot of color and a lot of flavor. So the first method is one that I got from watching the Basic Brewing channel. You get a quart of water up to 160 degrees in a little pot on your stove. Throw in a pound of your Pale Malt. Don't crush the grain because you're not doing a regular beer wort. You want all that sugar to stay inside those grain husks. And mash at 150 for an hour, hour and a half. And it's easiest, since it's just a small little pot, heat your oven up to like 155 and stick the pot in there. That'll maintain that mashing temperature for you. Let it go for an hour and then drain it. Save that wort that you drain off of those grains, because then you can just nuke it until it boils to sterilize it. Now you have a perfectly viable starter wort for getting a yeast starter going. So then you're just going to take that grain from your strainer, throw it into a pan, and you're going to roast that in the oven at 180 Fahrenheit for about an hour. And that's basically, you're just drying it. And then you're going to dry it a little bit more at 200 for 2 hours. And then the last stage is actually putting most of the color on it, and that's going to be 350 degrees for 30 to 40 minutes. And this one ends up coming out looking like this on the inside. The wort that you get has this, it's basically a nice light amber. To me, it was toasty, kind of a Wheaties flavor to it. To me, it tasted like turbinado sugar. I think it'll make a really good contribution to just about anything. Okay, so the last one is a little bit more complicated on the kilning side, but it saves you a couple of days on drying. So it's a good thing. This one I'm calling a crystal malt because I started it green. Traditionally, crystal malt is started while it's still green and it's hit full modification, and the roots and the shoot and everything, it's all still alive. So we take that raw green malt and we throw that into a roasting pan and we roast it at a low mashing temperature, 150 degrees, for about an hour and a half. So that's going to allow the enzymes inside that grain to start breaking down all the starches and turn it all into liquid sugar inside the grain. Then you're going to raise the temperature to 200 for about an hour, and that's going to help it start to dry. And then you're going to raise it to 250 for about 2 to 2.5 hours. And don't forget to stir every 30 minutes. If you don't, it's going to burn. You're going to ruin it, and that really sucks. Then the last stage is 1 to 2 hours at 300 degrees to put the final color on it. And this stuff turned out looking like burnt black sugar on the inside. It's shiny, kind of looks like obsidian on the inside. It's really interesting. The color that it contributes is this deep, rich brown with a little bit of ruby to it. I'd have to say the flavor of that one is my favorite because it tastes like Fig Newtons and grape nut cereal. It's really special. I like it a lot. So I'm really looking forward to using all of these grains. They are super cool, and this was a really deep and involved process. I learned a ton, and I know that I still have a lot more to learn. So remember this, brewing beer the hard way, very helpful resource, but that's not the only resource, and neither am I. Google is your buddy. Google your ass off, and then get started experimenting. Oh, one last thing. It is highly recommended when you make specialty malts to store them in a way that they will off-gas, like a paper bag, for 1 to 2 weeks. And that will eliminate some of the harsher volatile compounds in the aromas, and you'll get a more rounded product. I haven't tested whether or not that's true. There is some debate on whether or not that's even necessary. All this stuff has sat open on my counter for a week and a half, so I'm just going to go ahead and use it. It's ready. Yeah, even the chocolate malt, it still smells like coffee, which is really cool. That's so awesome. So I just want to say a huge thank you to my patrons. You guys are awesome. Without you guys, I would not be able to do these videos in as much detail and as often. And I appreciate all of your advice and your input on the Patreon page too. If you are not a patron of mine and you would like to be, check the link down in the video description so you can go to my Patreon page and see what that's all about. So, if you learned anything, if you made it all the way through this monster video and you learned anything, you thought it was interesting, it opened your eyes to the wonders of malt, do me a favor and hit the like button because it really helps out the channel. If you want to find out what I'm going to do with the beer that I'm going to make, hit the subscribe button and the little bell icon right next to it so you can follow along and be notified when I post new content. If you have any suggestions, questions, comments about the malt, feel free to post them down in the comment section down below. I think that is about it. I have a beer to brew and also this video to edit. Whew, this is going to take a while. All right, thanks for watching. Talk at you later.